Let's bring in former federal Labor leader, now currently the leader of One Nation in New South Wales, Mark Latham. Thanks for joining us, Mark. Firstly, your thoughts on your thoughts on Kevin Rudd from afar lecturing Australia as to what it should do to deal with the coronavirus outbreak.
Well, Chris, you know, some things never change with Kevin. It's only ever about Kevin. And I would have thought, talking about that package, the first thing he should do is apologise profusely for the deaths of the young fellas in the Roos who died as part of the faulty pink bats program. That was a tragedy, not only an economic waste, but a dreadful waste of human life and the families who suffered for many years since. So you can rush into these things with too much haste. You can pretend all those years later that they were perfect. In fact, the package was very much flawed, with the pink bats and also the very expensive school halls that didn't provide stimulus when it was needed. It came years later, because government's got to learn that lesson, whether you're talking about the Keating government stimulus in the early 90s or the Rudd-Swan package. If you do capital works, then the time it takes to get project approval, to get capital funding, to get it organised, to get it built, normally the stimulus comes when the economic recovery is already well underway. So the lesson for government is, yes, do something about business cash flow, yes, do something about cash flow for consumers, but also be very careful, because the obvious lesson in this country is if we're plunged deeply into federal government debt and deficit, it could take another decade to get us out of it, and we're weakened for the time of the next crisis.
Well, that's exactly right, and this is the point that a lot of people seem to be missing. There seems to be a lot of commentary around just go hard, go as hard as you like, but it's precisely because of the consequences of that overblown stimulus and governments, Labor and Liberal, failing to get on top of the debt and deficit situation that we've been rendered so vulnerable now. So you've got to be careful, don't you? It's however much we dislike Kevin Rudd pontificating, it's a timely reminder not to go too hard.
Well, that's right. The Rudd government overdid it, mainly off the back of the surpluses that were built up by the Howard government with Peter Costello as the Treasurer, and it's taken Australia more than a decade to, you know, have any glimmer of hope of getting out of that cycle of budget debt and deficit. So you can overdo it, and I think there's a big caution there for Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg to learn those lessons, because, you know, realistically, today's politics, so many spending promises, so many media and public pressures to pretend that spending money is the solution in itself. Once you get into deficit, it's very hard to get out, particularly with the economy slowing. So I just think they need to be mindful of that, to target support where it can do the greatest amount of benefit with the business balance sheet, and also some consumer spending, which is always important. But if they go down the path of school halls and pink bats and big capital infrastructure programs, I'm afraid we'll be in deficit, and we'll find out that a lot of the money didn't really have an immediate economic impact when it was needed.
Now, I think then everybody would agree they need to do something, because business needs some support. We've got to try and keep people in work, and you've got to demonstrate a level of confidence. Andrew Clennell is suggesting that there are going to be payments, direct payments, as part of this package announced tomorrow, payments to people on the pension, perhaps New Start. The worry here surely is that people just won't spend that money. If you're a pensioner and you get a $500 or $600 bonus, especially in the current circumstances, a lot of people will sit on that thinking they might need it.
Well, that tends to happen, Chris, if you go to middle income and high income earners who've got a propensity to save. But it is true that for low income earners, welfare recipients, pensioners, they do tend to spend most of their budget. So that's targeting, that if you get it to the people who spend it all, you get the maximum hit for the government dollar. So that's a very important consideration. But, you know, it's also a vexed question here for government policymakers, because there's three dimensions to this. There's a productivity shock that's coming if we go into a lockdown like Italy. There's a supply side shock to the economy, the goods that just don't come out of Asia anymore. Yep. We don't make them here. We rely on clothing, electronic goods, car parts coming out of Asia. A lot of that is slowed down or even frozen now. And then the demand side, where in uncertain economic circumstances people don't spend as much. So it's very hard to deal with the productivity and the supply shock. At least you know that if you're funding up pensioners, they will spend the money, and hopefully it does some economic good.
Yes, well, we'll find out more about that tomorrow. Just your thoughts first up, though, on the level of cooperation we're seeing between the federal government and state governments on this. This is a classic challenge for the whole country. Scott Morrison has talked about Team Australia. I think Daniel Andrews, the Premier of Victoria, a Labor Premier officer, he seems to have been front and centre, showing pretty strong leadership. There seems to be reasonable coordination, even though states are taking slightly different approaches.
Well, there needs to be coordination. I'm glad to see the federal government providing public health services, because you just couldn't leave that to the states with these pop-up clinics or the pressure on our public hospital system. So I think the Morrison government really, in setting up quarantine centre on Christmas Island, the travel bans, and now the support for public health, has done a pretty good job here. It's hard to be critical of how they've reacted in unprecedented circumstances, and I think the states have responded quite well. I know here in New South Wales that the Education Minister's not taken any risks in the school system or the university system. So too the Health Minister, and the health advice seems to be spot on. But, you know, generally in terms of the role of the public, it's a time where people need to avoid being selfish, whether it's panic buying and having fights in supermarkets over toilet rolls, or being carefree about your own public health consequences if you've got this infection. You know, people need to think of their fellow citizen. If there is a Team Australia, it's to pull together and think, well, I'm thinking of other people, not just my own individual circumstances, because if people just put the individual first, then we'll all suffer.
Yeah, well, let's move on to some other issues that you've been directly involved in here in New South Wales, in the New South Wales Parliament. This bill you've put forward to clear the way for a nuclear industry in New South Wales. You've got support from none other than the Deputy Premier, the leader of the Nationals in New South Wales. You seem to have blown the coalition apart with your quite sensible proposal.
Well, it is a sensible proposal because, you know, you look at the energy and climate debate, nuclear is the logical answer. It's a safe, reliable, dispatchable baseload power source. It keeps the lights on, and it's zero emissions. So why wouldn't the Greens and Labor, talking about a climate emergency, saying it's time to ditch their historic opposition to nuclear and say the emergency is such they need to go down that path? So it's got a lot to commend it. But just on this thing about the New South Wales coalition, John Barilaro, as the Deputy Premier, has been leading this debate for 3 years. I haven't led the debate. My legislation is a response to Barilaro's leadership. And I just find it remarkable. I don't know what sort of policy-making culture they've got inside the state government, if at all, that they could have the Deputy Premier leading up a debate for 3 years saying we urgently need to lift the nuclear ban, and then when it comes to legislation and potentially a vote on it, they're all in a state of shock. You know, what did they think was going to happen here? So Barilaro's shown the leadership. It's good policy, and they need to get a policy-making culture where they sort these things out instead of being caught like stunned mullets when someone has a go at it.
Well, it's a fascinating dynamic, though, because there's two big issues where John Barilaro and the Nationals are at odds, essentially, with their own government position. It's this nuclear issue and also the net zero by 2050 emissions promise. You would think that they would have this policy debate within the coalition and come to a position, yet they seem to be just happy to allow the Deputy Premier to be out there arguing against it day in, day out.
Yeah, it's a good point, Chris. If you don't have a policy culture and you're constantly researching, thinking about ideas, debating them, getting to a resolved position, then ultimately you're not much of a government. And I'm told in the Liberal Party room in Macquarie Street, New South Wales politics, they don't have any policy debates. They sort of sit there and listen to announcements. Well, they need to debate things of substance. Barilaro has said that the net zero 2050 goal would destroy mining and agriculture in New South Wales, and he's put his position out there over a long, long period of time about nuclear. Shouldn't they be debating these things internally and coming to a resolution, a position that they can then take forward for the benefit of the people of New South Wales? I just find this hollow, vacuous policy making to be pathetic. And then you've got the influence of lobbyists and interest groups that have got big money on renewables. They bet big at the casino that renewables will be the way of the future. They don't like nuclear for that reason. And it seems that elements of the New South Wales government are starstruck by that lobbying and money as well. So, you know, you've got to get policy right. There's no substitute for that. And quite frankly, in these big areas, the coalition should have had it right years ago.
Now, just finally on the Police Minister, David Elliott, he got into a bit of a road rage argument last year. He went AWOL during the bushfires, and now there's pictures turned up of him squeezing off an automatic weapon on a firing range without a licence. Should he go?
No, not at all. I mean, these photos are 18 months old when he was in a different portfolio area. And Chris, you've been to a few political openings in your time, as have I. And
I've never used a machine gun at them.
Well, no, well, I've never opened a firing range either. But when you go to these things as a politician, you're expected to do a ritual, an activity that's consistent with the opening that you're performing. So
yep.
The fact that he had all the experts there from corrective services, he was opening up a firing range. Of course, you're going to fire off a few rounds and work on the assumption that the officials have done all the paperwork. So I think this is blown way out of proportion. David Elliott is a pretty good police minister. I think he's one of the better ministers in substance in this New South Wales government, and I'd hate to see him moved at all.
I said I'd never fired a machine gun at a launch, but I did allow myself to get tasered for television, so
there you go.
There you go.
There you go. Did you have a permit, Chris? Did you have a permit?
It may have been illegal. It certainly felt like it.
Well,
thanks for joining.
Too many permits, mate. Let's just get on with it.
Indeed. Thanks for joining us, Mark.
Pleasure.